Chapter 10 The Ashantis Part 3 The Rise of Ashanti 1700 to 1803. Beginning in 1700 for Chapter 10. The beginning of the 18th century witnessed the first encroachments towards the coast of the Ashantis, who, though hitherto unheard of, were destined in the near future to play a greater part in the history of the Gold Coast than all the other tribes combined. From this time forward, in fact, the history of the country is largely a history of its relations with this people. Although tradition asserts, and other evidence favors, the belief that this people and the Fantis and other tree-speaking races are the offsprings of a common stock, yet the Ashantis stand out in marked contrast to all the others, distinguished as much by their skill and bravery in war, by the patriotism and power of combination that ultimately led to the formation of the most powerful and in fact the only really important kingdom and empire that the Gold Coast has ever seen. From small beginnings, these people gradually extended their power and authority, both by diplomacy and by force of arms, until in the end, all the surrounding tribes owed allegiance to them, and their countries became tributary provinces of Ashanti. Nor can there be the least doubt that the kingdom would, before the close of the 19th century, have included the whole Gold Coast, had not the seaboard tribes been assisted and protected by the Europeans, who feared their settlements and trade might be endangered. The rise and fall of the power of Ashanti furnish some of the most interesting chapters of Gold Coast history, and no one who studies the subject with an unbiased mind can avoid feeling admiration and some sympathy for this remarkable people, though it is difficult for those who have suffered many privations and losses on their account, and have lived for years in almost constant dread of them, to regard them without prejudice. Lord Wolseley, who, as Sir Garnet Wolseley, was governor of the Gold Coast and led the expedition against them in 1874, wrote, "From the Ashantis I learnt one important lesson, namely, that any virile race can become paramount in its own region of the world if it possesses the courage, the constancy of purpose, and the self-sacrifice to resolve that it will live under a stern system of Spartan military discipline, ruthlessly enforced by one lord and master, the king. In other words, if it be clearly recognized by any people that the interests and comfort of the individual, whether he be king or subject, should not be the first object of national solicitude, but rather that it should be the greatness and power of the state as a whole, a greatness which brings with it national pride, individual security, and also contentment, that nation will rule over its neighbors. The Ashanti and the Fanti were absolutely of the same race. The former were a proud nation of brave and daring soldiers, living happily and contentedly under the most absolute of kings. The latter, who lived and idled under the license of our easy-going laws, were cowardly, lazy, good-for-nothing vagabonds, with all the vices of the Ashanti but with none of the manly courage, military despotism, in some cases, supplies the nation brave enough to adopt it with a renown that makes life worth living and worth fighting for. The cowardice of the Fanti has at times been exaggerated, and he has been blamed for it more than he really deserves. His inefficiency as a warrior is due to the faults in the system rather than in the individual. Taken man for man, the Fanti is probably nearly as good as the Ashanti. The Ashantis, however, have built up a splendid military organization, to the perfection of which everything else has been sacrificed, and they have learned to rely on themselves and to put the national interest before their own. The Fantis, on the other hand, have suffered from their long contact with the Europeans. Their surroundings and their mode of life have to some extent become artificial, and they have been taught to rely upon the protection of a stronger race rather than upon their own efforts. Though they have a military system similar to that of the Ashanti, it has never been brought to such perfection nor made to take precedence to other things, but has rather been allowed to atrophy from disuse. They have seldom or never really combined, but in the face of the most overwhelming common danger, have proved quite unable to put aside their own petty intertribal quarrels and disputes. And though they have again and again turned out in vast numbers to oppose the inroads of the Ashantis, and have on more than one occasion shown considerable bravery and fought really well for a time, yet, in the end, this lack of cohesion and common purpose has invariably shown itself, with the inevitable result that defeat, panic, and flight have followed. For no matter how brave the individual units of a badly organized force may be, it can never hope to withstand the resolute advance of a disciplined foe. For this neglect of their military system and the production of artificial conditions, however, the English are as much to blame as the people themselves. They had no wish to see them too strong and warlike, lest their own position among them should be endangered. But when the mischief had been done, they forgot or ignored the part they had played in its production, and merely reviled the Fantis. These conditions, however, were not brought about by the English solely for the selfish purpose of securing their own safety and power. There was another motive also, that of the missionary and philanthropist who wished to abolish at once all those customs and beliefs which, though natural to the people, were repugnant to them. Those who were actuated by this motive, however, forgot that the evolution of civilization is as definite and gradual, though not so slow a process, as the evolution of species. It is impossible to hurry a race forward in the course of a few years to a stage which it would not otherwise have reached for several centuries, except by paying the inevitable penalty for interference with any such natural law. The civilization acquired or imposed by such artificial means is for the most part no more than a veneer, which is easily peeled off and has the terrible disadvantage of adding the vices and defects incidental to the new condition without having first eradicated those that previously existed, while it also tends to destroy those better qualities that were inbred in the subject in his natural state. There are, of course, occasional but very exceptional instances of men who survive this process and appear at first sight to justify it, but they are examples of the survival of the fittest, the giants of their race, who would inevitably have come to the front by the very force of their own stronger characters. These rapid transitions from a barbarous or semi-barbarous state to a far higher plane of civilization are harmful, and the only sure means of attaining the object aimed is to allow nature to follow her own methods. The process must be a gradual one and cannot be hurried, though it may be assisted and accelerated by tactful encouragement, sympathy, and example. The race must advance as a whole, and no matter how rapid its advance may be, it must tread every rung of the ladder. The unnatural elevation of a small number places them at a disadvantage. It is equivalent to forcing a handful of plants into premature bloom in the artificial surroundings of a hothouse, and then relegating them to their original positions among their naturally growing companions in the open. They must nearly all perish in the struggle that follows. but the people themselves cannot be blamed for the effects these unnatural conditions produce in them. The fault lies rather with those whose ill-advised attempts at improvement were responsible for their production. They may be studied among the people of whose towns that have been longest occupied by Europeans, and better still in Sierra Leone, where the process has been carried farther and its effects are therefore more pronounced. The moral undoubtedly is to give the people more time, and to aim at improving them in ways that are suited to their own surroundings, preserving all that is good and only eliminating that which is bad in their own institutions and customs, instead of destroying everything of their own and then forcing upon them the manners and customs and religious beliefs of a civilization that is the outcome of centuries of life in a different climate and under different conditions, which are quite unsuited to the African. Even a few of the people themselves are alive to these truths. One of them wrote, "The missionary and the merchant have only succeeded in making whited sepulchres of Africans. Under the existing state of affairs, the African becomes more and more useless, in fact, dangerous to himself and his country. Many charges have been made against the Ashantis. Some are baseless, others are easily explained and extenuated, and of none can it be said that there are more than could be levelled at any race in their condition. The mere fact that some of them were made at all shows ignorance or thoughtlessness, and is in itself sufficient proof of the existence of a very real spirit of hostility towards them. In fact, the Ashanti is perhaps the most abused and least understood man in Africa. They have constantly been accused of procrastination and a policy of covering up their diplomatic failures with excuses and apologies. This charge is, to some extent, true, though in many instances it has been made without justification. But there is no possible reason why these traits in their character should be set down as a special and distinctive Ashanti attribute. They are common to Africans generally, and if they have been specially noticeable in the Ashantis, it is only because the frequent importance of the government's relations with them and their own independence of character and national pride have combined to bring them into greater prominence. No ordinary African appreciates the value of time. His diplomacy, as that of other people, often takes the form of deceit, and he is ever ready with an abundance of excuses and apologies. This has probably led to the Ashantis being suspected of making ingenious excuses on some occasions when they were in reality perfectly serious. But if this is not so, then the greater plausibility of their statements merely proves their superiority in skill and brain power over the other tribes. Other and more serious charges against them are that they are treacherous, bloodthirsty, and guilty of the most wanton and inhuman cruelty. The charge of treachery is absolutely unjustifiable. The Ashanti is naturally brave, and for a savage, chivalrous. And no really brave man is ever treacherous. An occasional blackguard may of course be found, but to quote his misdeeds as characteristic of the race is ridiculous and unjust. They have always shown themselves brave and honorable in war beyond anything that might have been expected of a barbarous race little more advanced than the ancient Britons of 2,000 years or more ago, and they will easily bear comparison in this respect with some other races of modern times, boasting of a far higher civilization. Never have they been known to fire upon a flag of truce, nor to murder an ambassador, and their boast that they have never taken up arms until they have first tried diplomacy has been repeatedly justified. The worst that could truthfully be said of them in this connection is that their unbounded ambition may sometimes have led them to seek a pretext for a dispute that might have been avoided. There were a few powerful nations, however, against whom this charge could not be substantiated. Meredith, in his description of the sending of a flag of truce into the Ashanti camp after the attack on Anamabo Fort in 1807, writes, "Here we cannot forbear remarking that although the Ashantis are so remote from polished or civilized nations, they seem not to be unacquainted with the customs of a civilized people, as they are connected with the rules of war, for they paid every respect to the flag of truce." On the other hand, he says that the commandant and another gentleman, not in the service, had, only a day or two before, had to escort the Ashanti bearers of a similar flag nearly to their camp, because private information was received that the flag of truce would be violated in its return, and the men murdered. In speaking of their trade and intercourse with the Accras, and the improving effect that it had upon the people, he says, "The Ashantis are evidently better acquainted with the rules of decency and morality than any people we know of in this country." Mr. James Swansea, too, in his evidence before the Committee of the House of Commons in 1816, said, "It is a singular thing that these people, the Ashantis, who had never seen a white man, nor the sea, were the most civil and well-bred people that I have seen in Africa. It is astonishing to see men, with such few opportunities, so well behaved." Dupuy, again, who visited the Ashanti capital as British consul in 1820, says of them, "The Ashantis of all ranks are thus loyal and zealous, and the king takes pleasure in recounting his forbearance and describing the aggravation that roused the vengeance of his ancestors and himself against those federal powers which, in an earlier age, were independent little kingdoms, and now submit to the yoke of government as provinces of the empire. The king took particular pains to ingraft an impression upon my mind that it was a maxim associated with the religion he professed, never to appeal to the sword while a path lay open for negotiation. He maintained that he would defy even his enemies to prove that his assertion deviated from the truth, either as regarded himself or his ancestors. Be this as it may, the Moslems themselves corroborate this assertion, although they accuse the government of unbounded ambition. It is worthy of remark that many of the whites upon the Gold Coast so far acquiesced in these sentiments as to admit that Ashanti has never been engaged in a war with the maritime states from sheer caprice and rapacity. I may also be permitted to quote Mr. Mollen's words to me, that he never knew the king to make a palaver without cause, or violate his word. The charge of cruelty stands on a different footing. Many of their customs are undeniably cruel, but this cruelty is dependent not so much upon any innate bloodthirstiness as upon the stage of civilization in which they are. Their principal atrocities have always been carried out in pursuance of their religious beliefs and practiced on criminals or prisoners of war. The religion of the African has been evolved in his environment by a natural process, and is an attempt to account for those phenomena of his daily life that he is unable to understand or explain. Beliefs of this kind, being naturally adjusted to the surroundings and intellectual powers of those who hold them, and providing, to their minds at any rate, the most plausible explanations of otherwise unaccountable facts, form a very real part of the daily lives of the people, influence their habits and customs, and are clung to and gone back to with a tenacity and persistence that it is difficult for people whose daily lives and religion are often things apart to understand. The religion of the African is, in fact, the religion natural to a man in his stage of evolution, and he is probably incapable of grasping any more abstract and, to him, less reasonable theory. A very large proportion of the so-called human sacrifices that are always adduced as evidence in support of this charge were really nothing more than public executions of criminals who, after condemnation, had been reserved until victims were required for some religious ceremony in which the sacrifice of human life was considered essential. It is true that they were not all murderers, but it must not be forgotten that it is only within comparatively recent times that the death penalty has been reserved for cases of wilful homicide even in England. Formerly, and at a time too when the English were infinitely more civilized than the Ashantis, men and women were hanged or burned almost daily for offences that would now be considered trivial. The judgment of a primitive race from a civilized standpoint is absurd, yet it is common enough. The sufferings of those unhappy wretches who were stretched upon the rack, broken on the wheel, or otherwise tortured, must have been fully as great, if not greater, than those of any victim in Ashanti, and these were commonly inflicted punishments. The higher race, indeed, would seem to have used its greater knowledge only to devise more ingeniously cruel tortures. It has been estimated that between the years 1170 and 1783, at least 50,000 persons suffered death at Tyburn alone, and were, moreover, tortured beforehand by being drawn or flogged at the cart's tail from Newgate. When the place of execution was moved there, 10 men were hanged together on the first occasion and 20 on the second, of whom 5 had been condemned for robbing a man of something valued at 3 pence, some nails, a knife valued at a penny, 2 shillings, and a counterfeit halfpenny. Men were branded on the cheek for clipping coin, and on a single morning in 1695, 7 men were hanged and a woman burned for this offence. Another woman was burned alive at Newgate in 1751, and the punishment appears to have been quite a common one for several years later. In 1767, Anne Sowerby was burnt at York for poisoning her husband, and it was not until the 18th of March, 1789, that the last woman was burned in England for coining, several men being hanged on the same morning for coining, robbery, and burglary. Nor do the tastes of the English people at this time appear to have been any better than those so freely condemned in the Ashantis, for it is notorious that so long as executions were carried out in public, they never failed to draw enormous crowds, who conducted themselves in the most disorderly manner and thoroughly enjoyed the spectacle. Macaulay, writing of the condition of England in the 17th century, says, "The implacability of hostile factions was such as we can scarcely conceive. Whigs were disposed to murmur because Stafford was suffered to die without seeing his bowels burned before his face. Tories reviled and insulted Russell as his coach passed from the Tower to the scaffold in Lincoln's Inn Fields. As little mercy was shown by the populace to sufferers of a humbler rank. If an offender was put into the pillory, it was well if he escaped with life from the shower of brick-boats and paving stones. If he was tied to the cart's tail, the crowd pressed around him, imploring the hangman to give it the fellow well and make him howl. Gentlemen arranged parties of pleasure to Bridewell on court days, for the purpose of seeing the wretched woman who beat hemp there whipped. A man pressed to death for refusing to plead. A woman burned for coining. Excited less sympathy than is now felt for a gold horse or an overdriven ox. Multitudes assembled to see gladiators hack each other to pieces with deadly weapons, and shouted with delight when one of the combatants lost a finger or an eye. But on all this misery society looked with profound indifference. With such a record in England itself, it is needless to particularize regarding the habits of the Fantis and the other coast tribes, which, however, were fully as bad as those of the Ashantis for very many years after the settlement of Europeans amongst them. The hostility that has been shown towards the Ashantis by the English was not of the former's seeking. They were always favourably disposed towards the Europeans and anxious to remain on friendly terms with them. Indeed, it is ridiculous to suppose that they could have felt otherwise, for they knew that it was their presence on the coast that provided them with a profitable outlet for their gold and slaves, and furnished them with the means of procuring such manufactured articles as they had learned to appreciate. The real cause of the subsequent troubles is to be sought, not in the hostility of the Ashantis, but in the jealousy and insolence of the Fantis, who, relying on the assistance and protection of the English, tried to keep all these good things to themselves and monopolize the whole trade. By doing so, as well as by doing it in the most objectionable manner possible, they left the Ashantis no alternative but to attack them. The English then threw in their lot with the coast tribes instead of forming an independent alliance for trade with their enemies, and in trying to defend them from the consequences of their conduct, themselves became involved in the quarrel.